Welcome, folks. This is Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters here at WJOPLP, Newburyport, Massachusetts. Thank you for delving into the good funk, as I like to say. And I'm excited about our guest here this today. I'm here with history professor Lauren Turek of Trinity University in San Antonio. I always got to point that out since there are multiple Trinities, and that's just in the US. Um, Lauren researches and writes on American religion, international human rights, and US foreign relations. She has written and edited scholarly works for books and journals and conferences, and is the author of To Bring the Good News to All Nations, Evangelicals' Influence on Human Rights and US Foreign Relations. Lauren, welcome to Race Matters. I'm excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you.
That makes two of us. I did get your book. I've started it.
Thank you.
Yes, I paperback.
Yes,
and
slightly cheaper.
and I trust me, and I understand how that goes. And it's my goal to get that read before we congregated here, but that's okay. You'll give me a little advanced notions and stuff in terms of all the things that we're going to do here today. You know, Lauren, one of the reasons why I wanted you to be on Race Matters is that, I've been inviting different guests, scholars, historians, and different folks, really setting the stage for the fact that we are headed into a presidential election. And
Yes.
while we'll talk a little bit about, politics, which tends to be the case oftentimes too, we really want to delve into the nomenclature of thinking about things such as religion, think about people's identities and everything too. I will start off by telling you, I am a former evangelical. I don't know where you fall on the spectrum or any of that stuff, and you can feel free to share that if you would like, but I know you do that work. And really, one of the things I thought about is thinking about your work and how you think about evangelical Christians and their relationship to American foreign policy and influences. It got me thinking about back when I went to evangelical Christian high school. I went to a
Mhm.
Christian college, for example, and really thinking about the conversations that were happening where folks were engaged in missionary activities, campaigns, really taking the gospel to other folks around the world, but not always thinking about it within a political framework. And I think part of that is because, I'm older than you, but I also entered undergrad really after the Cold War. And I know your work really focuses a lot in the parameters of about 1969,
Through about
1970,
1994. Yeah.
94. So you get a little bit of Clinton in there too. So, you know, your book, as I mentioned, I only recently started reading. I thought it was timely when it came out in 2020. And I still think it's really, truly timing as we really think about the heart of evangelical Christians and particularly how they serve on the forefront of being a power when it comes to global militarism and politics and even global peace. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as we think about American politics and global peace and the role that evangelicals play in that.
Yeah, I really like the way that you framed that it is not just one or the other, that in fact it's quite varied because evangelicals themselves are quite varied, or at least they historically have been in their political commitments. We might think of Nowadays, we tend to think of evangelicals as being more associated with the political right and with the Republican Party, but that is a development that happened over a period of time historically. We really can think of that as being a development of the post-World War II world and something that's deeply related to race in the United States, as well as a number of other factors. So I like that you framed it that way because we should always remember that evangelicals are not monolithic. They never
Not at
have
all.
been. And so we want to keep that in mind. Um, but yeah, so first of all, I will say, since you brought it up, I should probably mention a little bit about my background. So
Yes.
Yeah, historian of U.S. foreign relations. I have focused a lot on politically conservative Christians and their efforts to influence foreign policy, but I'm not religious. I'm not a Christian. So I'm writing as an outsider to their particular faith tradition. What I always tell people, though, is I approach my research with historical empathy as well as a critical eye. What I really want to understand is how beliefs, worldviews, and ideologies motivate domestic actors, so in this case, Americans, to care about foreign affairs and to advocate for specific policies. So I'm really interested in advocacy, for example, on issues related to human rights. And that is an issue that has uh, kind of resonances across the political spectrum. There are left-leaning evangelicals who are very concerned about human rights globally. The human rights they're concerned about are different than the human rights that right-leaning evangelicals might be interested in, which tends to
Just thinking
focus on,
about that first thing that came to my mind.
yeah. So human rights themselves itself is somewhat malleable. So the groups that I study tend to be very concerned about religious liberty as a core human right. And they're really concerned about that or about the ability of co-religionists to practice their faith. That's different from the kind of human rights that we might think of more liberal evangelicals being focused on, where they might be really concerned about political rights, right to bodily autonomy, so not being the victim of some dictatorship kind of imprisoning you or torturing you. That's that's a different kind of human rights that they're focused on. It's a much more capacious human rights.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Have you, in your research and the work you've done, have you leaned in to elements of liberation theology, particularly because
Yes.
I know you've done quite a bit of research and writing, especially in thinking about Central and South America, where the bases of liberation theology came to fruition in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just sort of to say, essentially, when I think of liberation theology in particularly South America, Central America, what I'm often thinking of are Catholic theologians or other sort of and others, so not just Catholics, but Catholic theologians who are perhaps more leaning towards the left, who are really interested in thinking about the way the church can serve the poor. So thinking about a preferential option for the poor, making sure that the church is serving those. And there were certainly evangelicals in the global south, in places like Latin America, who were saying to their evangelical brethren in the United States, hey, we need to be paying attention to this. We need to be thinking about the poor because, not because they don't care about evangelism, which is a big concern, but because from their perspective, if we cannot break man and woman out of the tyranny of poverty, how could they possibly be receptive to the gospel? So there's that happening. Now, many evangelicals in the United States are very worried, conservative evangelicals are worried about about liberation theology because they see
For obvious reasons, they would
yes.
worry about that
Yeah,
too.
they see that as being like this Marxism and
Yes.
so they're then inclined to say, "Oh gosh, we have to do something to stop this." And so you see them really becoming quite concerned about what's happening in Latin America.
It's interesting because while there's always been that great American influence, and we know this as history scholars thinking about U.S. Diplomatic relations, we can go all the way back. I mean, shoot, back to actually, you could really lean heavily in the 19th century. Some folks will take it even before then in terms of that sphere of influence and everything too.
Absolutely.
Well, my sense is that when I think about your work and I think about the dynamics and the politics of what's happening now, that there is a marriage between Republicans. So I'm going to stay on this side, this lens, real quick while I ask this question. There's a marriage between Republicans and evangelical, particularly Reagan Republicans. So I want to differentiate and say Reagan Republicans going back to the Cold War days, all the way up to this whatever type of Republicans we have now, in a sense that they're really trying to influence the world ideologically, much like the Reagan Republicans we're still seeing that today too. But in that marriage,
Hmm.
this marriage is happening with this notion of conservative Republicans and evangelicals, and how do we make this happen? That's my sense. Is that true? Is that false? Feel free to correct and educate me.
Yeah, I often think about this again as being this historical process. And so, I mean, sometimes we hear a rhetoric about, say, maybe Christian nationalism and the Republican Party. And in the work that I've done, one of the things I'm really looking at is essentially what has motivated conservative evangelicals to engage in foreign policy activism. And what I start to notice is that a lot of this is happening in the 70s. We're starting to see evangelicals coming together in not that they weren't politically animated before, but in the 50s and 60s, they're not as effective, they're not as unified around certain identity issues. And but they are feeling very besieged by changes that are happening, like the civil rights movement, like the feminist movement, that there are cultural changes afoot that make them feel as though their particular worldview is under assault and that they need to organize politically to fight back against that. And so we start to see in the 1960s and more so in the 70s, especially the late 70s, this coalescent party where we really start to see evangelicals coming into the political right, coming to be really staunch supporters of the Republican Party, but it's something that evolved gradually. And their foreign policy concerns are part of that. That there's also this anxiety that we have this huge world out there. There's a huge amount of population growth happening in Africa, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and there aren't nearly enough Christians there to convert people or to let them hear the word. And many of the more liberal Christian denominations are kind of getting out of the missionary game a bit, right? They've started to understand the problem of cultural imperialism and they've become uncomfortable. And evangelicals are like, oh no, we need to go out. We need to make sure that we're evangelizing all of these new growth centers. So they have anxieties about what's happening at home, but they also have anxieties about what's happening out in the world. And they are also seeing the potential that their political organizing could bring, right? That they're seeing that they have the opportunity to come together to resist changes that they don't like at home, like, for example, right, Roe v. Wade or integration of schools, right, which is a really big issue for them, or the tax benefits that their religious schools get, even when they have segregation academies. So the threats to that. But they're concerned about what's happening abroad. And so they start to come together to advocate. And one of the ways that they do this is in making sure that there is no part of the world that will be closed to them for evangelism. So parts of the communist world, parts of the Muslim world that are not open to them because of either cultural restrictions or laws, they want in. And so they want the United States to be adopting foreign policies that allow them to evangelize. And so they coalesce around those particular policies as well. And this is partly because they've seen other groups be very effective at this, right? There's a lot of advocacy in the 70s to make sure that Jewish people in Russia are not being persecuted, because the persecution against Jewish people in Russia was horrific. And there are large groups of people in Congress, in the US Congress, who are saying, we should not be normalizing trade relations. We should not be engaging diplomatically with a country that is abusing its citizens in this way. And evangelicals look at that and they're like, hey, yeah, our people either. We shouldn't be letting the Soviet Union be abusing Christians, locking them up, not allowing them to educate their children in their faith, beating them, tearing their churches down, all the other stuff that they're doing. That shouldn't be okay. And this is a really powerful argument. And it's one that resonates with members of Congress across the spectrum. Like, who wants to be against human rights? Who wants to be against religious freedom, right? Everybody can get on board with that. So it ends up being a really effective issue for them to come around in terms of foreign policy. And this helps them as they are looking towards which leaders they should support. Because they're initially pretty excited about Jimmy Carter.
Initially.
And then they find him very disappointing on a number of issues.
Yeah, initially, absolutely.
And then they're like, oh, Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Here's a guy for us.
I mean,
Reagan, yeah.
in looking at your work and looking through your CV and reading your stuff, I was thinking a lot about your book about Kristen Dumais' work with Reagan. Was it Jesus and John Wayne?
Such a great book.
It really is. And some of the stuff John Field's been putting out.
Anthea
Recently.
Butler.
Yes.
Great book.
Hers is somewhere up here with yours.
Everybody needs to read that book.
Oh, it is incredible. Well, the nice thing, not that there's anything longer or bad about longer works, it's just the narrative is short enough.
Yeah.
That you can really kind of navigate through it fairly quickly, even if the language may or may not be unfamiliar. But, in thinking about your work and thinking about, you're looking at evangelical Christians and U.S. foreign policies up to the Cold War, I bring us to 2017, and in 2017, we have a U.S. elected president who is justifying banning populations of people based off their religion. And
Yes.
really, and then seeing a population of these evangelical Christians applaud that by also condemning other countries for human right violations by really wanting to keep those folks out of the US and claiming border issues. I hope me understand the contradictions here because they don't make a lot of sense to me.
I find this particularly fascinating, and I think it marks a really important shift. Because one thing to know is that there were evangelical organizations that were very unhappy with the Trump administration. There are evangelical organizations that work specifically with refugee resettlement, and that's part of their mission. They were upset. But if you asked the base, right, the evangelical base, boy, are they applauding. So, one of the things that suggests is that much of this movement in some way is more perhaps about identity than about the specifics of the religion. So not about theology, right? That this has become much more of a political and identitarian movement in some ways than a strictly religious one. And many of these folks don't even necessarily, there's polling and whatnot and sort of studies. They're not necessarily regular churchgoers even. So evangelical in some ways has become more of a white identity marker
Would
than.
you Would you say though that, and I love the way you put that, especially in terms of that white identity marker, that even some of U.S. foreign policies and relations as it relates to evangelicals is centered on the fear of the darkening of America? A lot of it is really, you mentioned Christian nationalism and kind of massing
Yeah.
this sense of white supremacy that's driving this, or is it what they say? Well, we have legitimate concerns and threats and all of that, which again aids the contradictions that are there.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this seems like a kind of Christian national, so much in the Trump administration certainly seemed to be this Christian nationalism. And we even see that. So Mike Pompeo,
Mm.
who is, he's this then Secretary of State, he put together a whole commission to look at what US foreign policy should do, what should be the goals. And one of the things that he did was actually really implement this idea that these Christian US foreign policy should be animated towards advancing Christian nationalism, that promoting a particular view of religious liberty globally should actually be elevated above other human rights concerns. That should be the primary human rights concern. So we're seeing it in all sorts of ways, and certainly in this idea that there are certain types of acceptable people. And so when we think of, often when I think of Christian nationalism, I think it's helpful to have some kind of a definition in mind.
That's great. Yes.
And so when I think of it, I'm like really simply, it's an ideology, right? But it's the idea that maybe your Christian and national identities are one and the same. So if you're somebody, and to be clear, this isn't just a US phenomenon. There are religious nationalism all throughout the world, and all, there's Hindu nationalism in India and elsewhere, right? This isn't just an American phenomenon. But in the United States, in our context, this might or often does take this form that the belief that the US is a Christian nation, and therefore everything about it, its culture, its laws, its politics, its foreign policy should reflect Christian beliefs, but very specific Christian beliefs, right? It's Christianity there's so many different ways to interpret how you might live out a Christian faith. For conservative evangelicals, who are the ones who tend to be advocating for this is people who are advocating for like traditional values or traditional social hierarchies. So they might be opposed to gay marriage. They believe that men should have authority over women and children. They believe that only certain types of people, white, native born, Christian, that only those people are true Americans who should enjoy the full benefits of citizenship. And so you can see then, if you're thinking about that as an expression of Christian nationalism, how they might say, well, forget what the Bible says about welcoming the stranger, or that is simply something on the individual level and not the state level. We really need to make sure that this nation stays true to its founding principles as they see them, which again are very specific to their ideology, that, well, it really should stay kind of very white patriarchal. And so we can't have all of these folks coming in who are very different and bring in these different religious faiths. So they're rejecting that. What we really might think of is going back to the very beginning, which is religious pluralism, that it's always actually been a religiously pluralistic nation from the get-go.
And some people, of course, they miss that and again, making a generalization here, that's
Mhm.
going to say some, right? And I can't point out who those folks are and everything too. I was, as I mentioned to you in an email, I just got back from a roots and bluegrass festival.
I wanted to ask you what the music was. Yeah.
Oh, yep, roots and bluegrass. I'm kind of a
Fantastic.
funk brother. I can, blues and all that good stuff. And
Excellent.
so that one was in Vermont. Probably a few weeks ago, I was at another blues and roots and bluegrass festival, and this one was in Maine. And
Mm.
same demographic of folks, right? A lot of white people. I'm one of the few folks who look like me who show up at those things, but I lean in. But when I was at the one in Maine, there was someone who was camping out there, and at his campsite, because we set up tents, we camp out, we do that whole thing, we listen to music for 3 4 days, get
Love it.
rained on for most of it
Oh,
sometimes. But one person did something interesting that I'd never seen before. He set up a big, massive sign, and it said, "Help stop the," and I'm looking at it right now. I took a picture of it. "Help stop the persecution of Falun Gong." I believe I'm
no.
pronouncing that name right. And in it, he was out there surprisingly handing out literature, saying that, America must intervene in Chinese politics to advance the preaching of Falun Gong, which I'm no expert, only know what literature I read and all of that stuff. But I just found that intriguing, and then the biggest, of course, element too was we need to do this because we're worried about the Marxists and the communists. And this is in the
Yeah.
21st century.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, I also see this. I find some of this might say something about my search history, but whenever just from doing research, which always pulls up strange stuff, but I get advertisements that are about like end the persecution against Christians and by Russia in the war in Ukraine, right? And that there's this sense that it's I think so. I think evangelicals are still very concerned about this, and it is related to their fears about communism. One of the stories that I talk about in my book is about evangelical engagement in apartheid South Africa,
Mhm.
and you know this is I think universally we understand this was a horrifically racist system, and the reality was that there were U.S. evangelicals who were mostly advocating for gradualism in ending apartheid. And some of them later recognized the ways that that had compromised their faith and compromised their values. But they advocated gradualism. Why? Because they believed that the ANC was Marxist and that it might threaten the one, quote, Christian nation in Africa, in the continent of Africa. And so this fear of the spread of communism was really strong then, even in the 90s, right after the Soviet Union has collapsed. There's this fear that it's going to proliferate. We're still seeing it with concerns about what's happening in China with persecution of different religious minorities, right? All sorts, right? Not just Christian minorities, but these new religious movements like the one you mentioned, or the Uyghurs, right?
Mhm.
But that this becomes a way to talk about, in a way, broader concerns that many U.S. leaders have about the world's relationship with China at a time when China has made really significant inroads into many parts of the world through its investment initiatives. And it's this sort of sense that, well, what kind of world order do we want? Because, and then from there, you can sort of go out and think about what are the because as we think about what US foreign policy should look like or what the posture towards some of these other countries should be. Yeah.
So, folks, if you're just chiming in, I am here with Professor Lauren Turek of Trinity University in San Antonio. This is WJOP LP, Joppa Radio, and we're glad that you chimed in and everything. Lauren, what what is your sense of the for the future? And I know as historians and scholars, we look at the past, but we do that sometimes, trying in many ways to be prophetic, and it's hard to make those predictions. And so, I got kind of a two-part question. One, what is your prediction for the future when it comes to evangelicals in U.S. foreign policy, right, as
Mhm.
we continue to navigate forward, especially where we're seeing a precipitous decline in evangelicals that's there, and that's only going to continue. That's the trajectory we're headed on. So that's the first part. And I would say the second part is the fact that, do you think there are enough people out there reading the kind of stuff, particularly your book and other things, to understand the complexity, the perplexity of this relationship and thinking about American identity?
That's such a good question. I feel as though there was a high point of evangelical engagement in foreign policy that happens really sort of by the late 80s and through the 90s. They're really powerful by the late 90s in thinking about the passage of legislation like the International Religious Freedom Act. We often think about them as being engaged in issues related to US relations with Israel. But I don't think that they're as influential in foreign policy perhaps now as they once were. And so I don't know what the future holds. I always say historians are not, I'm not a great prognosticator. I don't like to predict, but I feel that there's an ebb and flow. And we may, it's a sort of to some extent depends on who's in power. And we certainly know that if, depending on the way that the winds blow, if Trump were to return to power, he would bring a lot of folks who ascribe to a certain vision for the United States and its foreign policy back. And then those folks might have more influence than they have certainly most recently. But I think we'll see. We'll see what happens. In terms of the sort of
The
second question.
Yeah, the second question, which really about folks who are not reading, your book or some of the other scholarly books that have come up thinking about evangelical Christians and politics.
Yeah, I think some of this is that we would benefit, I think, from more
Some of this
nuance
is
in
that
our
we
in our journalism on religion. And so I think we would benefit from having journalists who are really educated in the history of American religion and the sort of the religious experience, again, pluralistically, because there's a lot of different religious movements in the United States. And as you noted, evangelicalism is on a downturn. If I were prognosticating, I would say that 50 years in the future, evangelical groups might look back to the 80s as a moment when they actually may have sealed some decline in at a moment when they thought that they were perhaps at the vanguard. Some real changes that would have put them in a position of kind of global preeminence. At the same time, there's actually quite a lot of growth in their movement globally. So we'll see. That may just be a US phenomenon. But I do think if journalists and folks in the media, I think if they had a little bit better understanding of the way that these religious movements work and how they connect with politics and how they've used and shaped ideology, and again, I mean like a critical lens on religion, I think that would help. So folks are not maybe necessarily reading a bunch of academic books about this stuff, but I think the folks who do the reporting would benefit from having that background that they could then translate. In the same way that museums might do that. There's a museum. I'm on the board of the National Museum of American Religion, and one of the things, which is a new museum, they're in the process of getting that set up. I think one of the benefits of something like that is it aims to bring some of the best of scholarly work to a really broad audience. And I honestly think that's what we need to understand how religion has shaped American life, culture, and politics.
No, and I know about your background, and particularly in thinking about museum studies,
Yeah.
um, and everything that's there, and the work and influence that has in so many ways. Hey, what are you working on now? What projects are you working on right now?
So I just finished co-editing a gigantic book on the history of religion and politics with my colleague at the University of Northern Iowa, Kara Burnage. It's a history since 1775. It is supposed to be out at the end of the year, and it brings together a wide array of really wonderful scholars. So that's one thing. I'm really excited to have that wrapped up. I just finished a chapter on the role of religion in shaping American exceptionalism in US foreign policy. So that should be out in a future book with, I think, Georgetown University Press. And then I'm working on a book about US foreign aid, which will talk about religion and moral values, but is not specifically just about religion. It's about a whole host of related ideas and ideologies and how they have influenced US foreign policy.
That's exciting. I'm excited to add that to my own library, particularly because when I develop courses, one of the things I need to do a better job is really leaving the domestic sphere of thinking about particularly race, religion, and American politics, which I kind of stay centered there, and expanding that beyond the borders.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, and it's got a long history if we think about the role of race in shaping, you know, missionary work in the late 19th century. You can't separate these things. They're just completely integrated.
I could definitely do a better job. So tell us, as we bring this to a close here at Race Matter, Lauren, it's been really exciting to have you here. I know we're starting to run into some weird technical difficulties out of the blue. Um, what what does your academic year look like coming up? And I will say, as I was doing a little bit of work on you and reading about you a little bit more, that you are quite the popular professor. I'm just gonna, your students love you. I was reading some articles and stuff. I mean, you are a rock star, my friend.
That is very kind. I am very excited. So this semester, one of the things I'm teaching is a brand new class with our university archivist. We're teaching a class in oral history. I've been working with the University Roots Commission, and one of the things that came out of that project was a desire to make sure that we had more voices in our archive because our archive was very much, board of trustees minutes and that sort of thing, and we were missing a lot of people. And so we're offering an oral history class that's going to allow our students to do interviews with alums who are from a range of different affinity groups. So our Latinx alums, our AAPI alums, our Black alums, just so that those voices are represented. And so we get a sense of what was life like at this university, this what was a predominantly white university in the South, and what used to be a Christian university and is now mostly secular. So I'm really excited about that. And of course, I always teach our first year experience, and I teach a science fiction class for that. So yeah.
In this course that you're teaching, out of curiosity, in my just a curiosity question, are y'all looking at Cedric Robinson's work on racial capitalism? I didn't know if y'all were going to delve into that because I know you're going to get into it.
We have used that in the class we did on this roots project. So we looked at some of that. In this oral history class, it'll really be, it's very hands-on practical. How do we do oral history? And about the ethics of oral history. So we'll do a bit of that, but mostly focused on the really like nuts and bolts of how do we do these interviews? How do you set them up? What's the right way to go about this?
Well, that is wonderful. Lauren, thank you again for being my guest here on Race Matters. And one of the things that I like to do with all of my guests is I like to give them the last word.
Just I think to be curious, right? That there's so much out there to learn, and there's always a history to every current event. And so be curious about the ways that the past has shaped our present, because you'd be surprised how which aspects are new and which ones are actually just in some ways echoes or mirrors of the past. So we have a lot to learn from our history and can really help us understand the present, and also understand what might be most compelling or important for us to think about for the future.
Folks, this is Race Matters. You're listening to WJOPLP Joppa Radio. Thank you again for checking in. Hope to hear and see from you next time. Thanks to our guest, Lauren Turek of Trinity University. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really wonderful conversation.
Absolutely. Oh, pleasure's all mine.